My name is Omar Samra. I guess the way I would describe myself is I'm an entrepreneur, an adventurer, and aspiring future astronaut. I've got some of my gear here with me today. Of course, on any one expedition, whether we're climbing a mountain or skiing to the poles or just getting into the wilderness away from the comforts and safeties of modern civilization, there's a lot of equipment that we use. Some of it is quite bulky. There's a lot of it, so I can't have everything here today, but I brought a few things to show you that can kind of give you an idea of the kind of stuff that we use and the more important stuff that we use on our expeditions. In terms of climbing, we've got a few things here. It's just a basic of any climbing expedition or any climbing trip. This is the harness, so that's sort of the belt that goes around the waist, around the legs. That's what secures you to the rope or to the mountain. And of course, we use these metal carabiners here. These are the attachments to the rope and the various anchors. You've got these are very quick, easy release ones. Sometimes you require a bit more safety, so these ones screw on and off. There's a interesting device here, this one here. It's called a Jumar. And basically what happens here is that the rope threads through this loop here. Then you end up closing this. And then you can actually pull yourself using this mechanism. You can actually pull yourself on a rope. So that's when it's called climbing fixed lines. So a lot of the very big expeditions like climbing Mount Everest, those very, very long expeditions, they used the Jumar for quite a big part of the expedition, where the Sherpas or the support team actually fix the rope on the mountain itself. Throughout the expedition, as opposed to an alpine style expedition, like let's say if you're climbing in the Alps where there is no rope fixed to the mountain, but the rope team or the climbing team are roped together in one sort of 50-meter rope. Something like this, it's like a cordelette or a prusik cord. It's just a simple cord, but it's been tied in a way that makes it easy to release, and something like that can get you out of a very tight spot. So let's say if you'd fallen into a crevasse basically is a sort of a gap in the ice created by the movement of the glacier in sort of separate ways, creating these gaps. Sometimes when it snows, these gaps can get covered in snow, and that can be quite dangerous, because when you step, you realize that there's nothing really under your feet. So when you fall, but you're obviously still roped up and you're kind of dangling in the ground, you can use those prusik cords to using a very basic technique to climb on the rope itself until you can get to safety in a situation where there's no one else to help you. So that's a climbing harness. Typically on climbing expeditions, we use ice axes to sort of ascend the mountain. Those are two basic kinds of ice axes. This one's called an alpine axe, and this one's called a technical axe, or a technical climbing tool. The difference here, you can see it from the shape. One is quite long and straight. The other one is much shorter and curved. So the alpine axe is basically held in this way. Of course, usually you sort of take off these safety. This is just, you put these on just so to transport the axe so that it doesn't sort of rip up your bags. But basically, an alpine axe is usually held this way. So this part of the axe is usually pointing forward. And the reason for that is because when you're climbing when you're climbing a mountain, this axe is usually on the slope side. So if I'm climbing a mountain, the mountain is here, and then the downward slope is this way. So the axe is always on the uphill side. The reason for that is that I'm using it as a sort of almost like a walking stick or an aid as I'm climbing. Especially in deep snow, it can be quite helpful. And then if I fall down, there's a technique, basic technique in climbing that you have to learn in order to get onto a mountain called the self-arrest. So basically, if I'm climbing a mountain and I fall down, I basically do this. So you move the axe from your hand up here, and that's why you have this part facing backwards. Because when you do this, now it's facing forward, and that's what goes into the mountain. And then if you're falling down, sliding down, that sort of quick self-arrest mechanism will help you stay on the mountain, basically. And of course, I don't have them here, but on your boots, you wear what we know as crampons. Those are sort of 12-point sharp blades or teeth that fix onto the bottom of your boots. And those also help you with the same thing, help you stay on the mountain in a sort of a, in an emergency situation. Now, these kind of axes are good if you're climbing 40, maybe up to 50-degree terrain. When things become more steep, you need actually something where you're actually using your upper body to get up the mountain as well as your legs. Now, your legs are obviously the most important because that's what you use to push yourself up, and you use your hands sort of for support and for technique. And you see this one is designed differently. There's a place here where your hand can comfortably go in, and then you derive your kind of power by pulling down on here. And then this is an axe that you use to ascend a very steep face. So you would have two of those, one in each hand, and then basically what you would do is that you would put the axe into the ice face. This is like now a sort of a steep, near vertical ice face, and then you would go with the next axe. So you'd be standing in this position, and then basically with your crampons, in your boots, you would then take a big step, and then you'd be able to pull yourself up, so that now you're sort of in this position, and then you can, you do it again. The interesting thing here is that when you're climbing a steep face of ice, it's not about hitting the axe hard, because then it goes in very deep and it's extremely difficult to get on. It requires a lot of energy, and that could also throw you off balance. It's just to do, and you don't want to do it too light, because then it doesn't get the kind of perch that you want it to. But it's sort of that's the way the technique or the art comes into play, where you're doing it just hard enough for it to stick, but not make it difficult for you to for you to exert more effort to climb. So that's a technical ice tool. Of course, that's pretty rudimentary here. This is obviously just a regular compass. I wouldn't necessarily use this on a climbing expedition, but when we were skiing to the poles, whether the North or South Pole, mostly in the South Pole, we used not this exact one, but used another form of sort of a rudimentary compass, a bit more complicated or more sophisticated one than this one. And of course, when I did my 2 skiing expeditions, I was actually skiing to the geographic North and South Pole and not the magnetic. And of course, these compasses will point to the magnetic pole. So when let's say I'm on Antarctica and I'm still over 100 kilometers away from the pole, and the compass points in a certain direction, that direction is pretty much where both the magnetic and geographic pole are. But once the closer you get to the pole, then you realize that actually they are separate, because there's a big distance between both. So the closer you get to both poles, then they become in different directions. So what you need to do is that you look at these tables, and these tables basically tell you the amount of deviation in terms of degrees from the magnetic to the geographic. So as you're navigating, while the compass is pointing to the magnetic North Pole, you can then apply the deviation and figure out which direction you need to go to reach the geographic pole. On the North Pole expedition, we ended up using GPSs more than we did these compasses. And there's just 2 different ways. There's pros and cons to each one. Of course, when you use a GPS, you have to be concerned as well with battery and keeping that GPS live, because if it dies, then that's your only way of navigating, especially in the Arctic Ocean, where you're not walking on an actual continent, an actual landmass underneath you. You're on you're actually just on a frozen piece of ice when underneath you there's about 4 kilometers of freezing Arctic Ocean, and you're constantly moving. I remember one time in the North Pole expedition that we had, it was a big storm, and our team decided to push through that day. There was another team that decided to camp those 24 hours and not move, and they moved about 13 kilometers just by doing nothing. So that just goes to show how much movement happens in this sort of area, which again underpins the importance of navigation, because you're constantly moving. When we finally arrived to the North Pole, we were there, we saw the 90-degree coordinates, we took our photos, we were airlifted out 30 hours later, and we had already moved 11 kilometers from the pole. So it just goes to show how how a lot of the technology, whether it's just basic rudimentary tools or more high-tech technologies, can be very essential in expeditions, even though most people think that those sort of things are a very low-tech environment, whereas there is a degree of technology that actually helps quite a lot. I spoke about crampons, which these sort of 12-point blade type things that fix onto the bottom of the boots. So they would typically go onto a boot like this. As you see at these two boots, there's a section here and here where the back sort of loop of the crampon fits, and then there's a similar one in the front here and here. So that allows the crampon to fit onto those. Surprisingly, those two boots are actually the same size, although you can clearly see that one is much bigger. And the reason for that is that the one I'm holding in my left hand, this one, is actually it's a double boot, whereas there's another inside layer there, and there's much more coating, and there's much more warmth that goes into it. That type of boot here, again, it's also like the gaiter of the boot goes quite high as opposed to this one, and this is just one that's built for much more cold climates. So this is the type of boot that you would climb something like Everest with. It probably weighs just over 1 kilo for each pair. Now, there's a new model of this one that probably is a little bit lighter, maybe 0.7 or something. But in any case, they're quite heavy. I mean, compared to just a regular, sports shoe or cross trainer. This one is one that you typically climb also in a very cold climate, but a little bit more forgiving than somewhere like Everest. I climbed using this one in Alaska and in some expeditions in the Andes. Again, a very versatile boot that also has, just like the other one, has an inner boot as well. The only difference is in the other boot, the inner comes out completely. So again, all of these climbing boots are rigid, which means that no matter what I do, these soles cannot be bent. It makes it feel a little bit awkward at first when you start climbing with these type of boots, but that's essential to keep your feet stable. You also don't want any movement in the ankles, because you don't want to, with sort of uneven rocks and uneven surfaces that you're climbing, you don't want to twist something. So those provide warmth. Of course, they're very waterproof and weather, all types of weather resistant, and they allow you to attach the technical tools that you need to climb a mountain, like a steep mountain. Could speak a little bit about communication. This device here, the Explorer 500, that's a BGAN, we call it, by Inmarsat. That's basically a satellite modem. So what this will do is that it will be able to emit a network that will allow a phone or a laptop to basically connect to the satellite network wirelessly, and then you can actually transmit data. Of course, it's basically just like having a router at home or in your place of work, but just imagine that it's obviously much slower, to transmit data, and also much more expensive. So, it could cost. Don't call me on that, but I think it could easily cost $1 per megabyte or something close to that. So when we're on these expeditions, we're very frugal with what we're sending. We only send things if it's absolutely necessary. We also have to, in most cases, if we're going to send photos, usually that's done if someone's going on an expedition and they want to keep people in the outside world involved or knowing what's going on. Sometimes you have a sponsor, and the sponsor also, part of the arrangement is that you need to update regularly and so on. We obviously have to, we need to have software or tools to downsize these photos into a kind of a smaller format that can be transmitted. So if you wanted to transmit a high-res photo over a satellite communication equipment, that would take a very, very long time, and it would cost a lot of money. There are now devices that are smaller than this. I don't have it on me right now. There's a device called The Iridium Go. Iridium is another company like Inmarsat that works in the field of satellite communication. It's a device that's just, it's just this size and allows you to emits again a wireless network that allows you can even connect with your iPhone to it, and then you can use some of the apps on your iPhone to do some of the work that you need. There's also regular, obviously, satellite phones and so on. So that's just a cross section of some of the equipment that we use. Of course, other than that, there's all the technical clothing that we use, which is the whole philosophy just operates on layers. So instead of wearing one or two sort of big layers, you usually wear multiple layers. That gives you the flexibility to be able to adjust your temperature by the minutiae of degrees. So if you have a very, very heavy jacket and you take it off or you put it on, you can be either very cold or very warm. Whereas with changing layers, you can kind of, if you're feeling hot but not too hot, you can just unzip, a layer, or you can take one layer off or put one layer back on, and so on. So the clothing is also a big component. You've obviously got your tent, your sleeping bags, your cooking equipment. There is, in any one expedition, there's, sometimes hundreds of kilos of gear that go into it. So yeah, so that's just a cross section of the stuff that's there, and I hope that made sense.